On January 1st, 2024, BRICS comprised 5 nations, representing 23% of global GDP. On January 1st, 2025, BRICS includes 11 nations representing 37% of global GDP. Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE joined in 2024. Argentina, Bangladesh, and others are completing membership procedures for 2025. This expansion is not diplomatic success. This expansion is systematic preparation for monetary separation. The BRICS New Development Bank processed $33 billion in local currency transactions in 2024. $0 involved. The BRICS Contingent Reserve Arrangement now holds $240 billion in non-dollar reserves. The BRICS payment system completed its first phase, connecting central banks across member nations without touching the SWIFT network. Total bilateral trade settlements between BRICS members reach $400 billion in local currencies during 2024. That represents a 340% increase from 2023. China-Russia trade occurs entirely in yuan and rubles. India-Iran oil payments settle in rupees. Brazil-China agricultural trade operates in yuan and reals, but the numbers only reveal the surface pattern. The deeper reality is mathematical. When 37% of global economic output creates financial infrastructure that bypasses the existing system faces terminal pressure. This is not competition with the dollar. This is replacement of the dollar. And replacement follows the same systematic pattern that has destroyed every reserve currency in recorded history. The frame, the pattern. Reserve currency transitions occur through identical stages across different time periods and different civilizations. The pattern is mathematical rather than political, predictable rather than random, systematic rather than chaotic. First, the reserve currency begins showing structural weaknesses: excessive debt accumulation, persistent trade deficits, monetary policy conflicts between domestic needs and international responsibilities. The issuing nation prioritizes domestic concerns over reserve currency stability. Second, alternative currencies emerge through bilateral arrangements. Trading partners begin settling transactions in local currencies to avoid reserve currency volatility or political weaponization. These arrangements initially appear marginal but create infrastructure for broader system change. Third, alternative financial institutions develop parallel systems, new banks, payment networks, and monetary arrangements that operate independently of reserve currency systems. These institutions serve initial adopters and gradually expand their capabilities and membership. Fourth, a critical mass of global economic activity operates outside the reserve currency system. When sufficient volume of international trade occurs through alternative arrangements, network effects favor continued expansion rather than return to the original system. Fifth, the reserve currency loses pricing power in critical global markets. Energy, commodities, and industrial goods begin trading in alternative currencies. The reserve currency nation can no longer influence global economic conditions through monetary policy. Sixth, the reserve currency nation faces impossible policy choices: raise interest rates to defend the currency and crash the domestic economy, or maintain easy monetary policy and accelerate international abandonment. Either choice accelerates the transition. Seventh, the reserve currency system collapses and resets around new arrangements. Wealth stored in the old reserve currency evaporates. New power structures emerge based on control of alternative systems. This pattern has repeated consistently throughout monetary history. The Byzantine solidus, Spanish peso, Dutch guilder, and British pound all followed this identical sequence. Each transition seemed impossible until it became inevitable. The historical machine. Spain, 1598 to 1650. The Spanish peso was the world's first global reserve currency. Spanish silver from the Americas provided the foundation for international trade. European merchants, Asian traders, and African kingdoms all used Spanish silver coins for commercial transactions. But Spain's monetary system contained structural contradictions. Silver inflows funded massive government spending on European wars and administrative bureaucracy. Spanish domestic production declined as imported goods became cheaper than local manufacturing. The trade balance turned negative despite massive silver exports. Other European nations began creating alternative arrangements. Holland established the Amsterdam Exchange Bank in 1609, enabling trade settlements in multiple currencies without requiring Spanish silver. Venice maintained its own monetary system for Mediterranean trade. German states created regional trade agreements that bypassed Spanish currency. By 1630, alternative systems handled 40% of European trade volume. Spain responded by debasing silver content in coins, creating inflation that made Spanish currency less attractive for international reserves. Foreign holders began converting Spanish silver into gold or alternative currencies. The 30 Years' War accelerated the transition. Spain borrowed extensively to fund military operations, creating massive debt service obligations. Spanish silver outflows to pay foreign creditors reduced domestic money supply, causing economic contraction. Alternative currency systems expanded while Spanish commerce contracted. By 1650, the Spanish peso had lost reserve currency status. Dutch guilders became the preferred medium for international trade. Spanish economic power collapsed within 2 generations. The empire that controlled global silver flows became dependent on foreign financing within 50 years. Britain, 1920 to 1944. The British pound sterling dominated international trade for over 2 centuries. London served as the global financial center. Most international transactions occurred in pounds, and most central bank reserves consisted of British government bonds. World War I created structural damage to the British monetary system. War financing required massive money printing and borrowing from the United States. British gold reserves fell from 183 million ounces to 137 million ounces between 1914 and 1918. Britain ended the war as a net debtor for the first time since the Napoleonic Wars. Alternative arrangements began emerging immediately. The United States dollar started competing with sterling for international reserves. France, Germany, and other European nations increased gold reserves rather than holding sterling balances. Trade settlements increasingly occurred in dollars rather than pounds. The 1931 sterling crisis accelerated the transition. Britain abandoned the gold standard and devalued the pound by 30% overnight. International confidence in sterling collapsed. Central banks systematically reduced sterling reserves and increased dollar holdings. By 1936, dollar reserves exceeded sterling reserves in international central bank holdings. The United States had replaced Britain as the largest creditor nation. American financial institutions began competing directly with London banks for international business. World War II completed the transition. British war financing required extensive borrowing from the United States. The 1944 Bretton Woods Conference officially recognized the dollar as the new global reserve currency. Sterling maintained regional importance through the Commonwealth, but lost global dominance permanently. The British economy required decades to adjust to post-reserve currency reality. Manufacturing competitiveness declined as sterling was no longer in constant demand for international transactions. British trade deficits became chronic as demand for British goods fell relative to demand for American products. Soviet Union, 1970 to 1991. The ruble never achieved global reserve currency status, but it dominated trade within the Soviet economic sphere. Comecon countries conducted most international trade in rubles. Soviet energy exports to Eastern Europe occurred through ruble-denominated agreements. Alternative arrangements emerged as Soviet economic performance deteriorated relative to Western economies. Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia began seeking Western currency earnings to import advanced technology. China split from the Soviet system and established independent trade relationships with Western nations. By 1980, Eastern European nations were borrowing Western currencies to finance imports while maintaining ruble-based trade with the Soviet Union. This created unsustainable dual currency obligations. Economic performance in ruble-denominated trade declined while Western currency trade became more attractive. The 1985 oil price collapse reduced Soviet hard currency earnings, creating fiscal crisis that accelerated systemic breakdown. Soviet satellite states could no longer maintain ruble-based economic relationships while seeking Western currency integration. Economic pressures contributed directly to political collapse. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the ruble lost all international monetary role immediately. Former Soviet republics adopted alternative currencies or established independent monetary systems. The transition was sudden and complete, rather than gradual. Translation to the present. Current BRICS developments follow the identical pattern that preceded previous reserve currency transitions. Alternative arrangements are expanding systematically, while the dollar system shows structural weaknesses that mirror previous reserve currency failures. The dollar system displays classic late-stage reserve currency characteristics. U.S. national debt exceeds $38 trillion, requiring constant international financing. Trade deficits average $800 billion annually, meaning more dollars flow out of the United States than goods flow in. Interest payments on government debt consume $1.1 trillion yearly, forcing monetary policy to prioritize debt service over currency stability. BRICS nations are creating comprehensive alternatives to dollar-based systems. The new development bank operates independently of World Bank and IMF institutions. The BRICS contingent reserve arrangement provides emergency financing without requiring IMF conditionality. The BRICS payment system enables central bank transfers without using SWIFT networks. Bilateral trade arrangements between BRICS members eliminate dollar involvement entirely. China-Russia trade reached $240 billion in 2024, conducted entirely in yuan and rubles. India pays for Iranian oil in rupees, circumventing dollar-based sanctions. Brazil-China agricultural trade operates in local currencies, avoiding dollar conversion costs. The expansion of BRICS membership accelerates alternative system adoption. Saudi Arabia's membership brings the world's largest oil exporter into non-dollar trade arrangements. UAE membership provides Middle East financial center capabilities independent of New York and London. Egypt's membership connects African trade networks to alternative systems. Energy trade represents the critical transition point. Oil sales historically required dollar payments, creating automatic demand for dollars, regardless of other economic factors. BRICS energy producers now accept alternative currencies for oil exports. Russia sells oil to China, India, and other BRICS members in local currencies. Iran accepts rupees and yuan for energy exports. This energy transition eliminates the petrodollar recycling mechanism that sustained dollar demand for 50 years. When energy exporters accept alternative currencies, those currencies gain reserve characteristics while dollar demand falls structurally rather than cyclically. Financial infrastructure development supports expanding trade volumes. The BRICS payment system processed $47 billion in transactions during 2024, entirely outside dollar-based networks. Central bank digital currencies enable instant settlement between BRICS members without correspondent banking relationships through New York. The mathematical progression matches historical patterns exactly. Alternative systems started with bilateral arrangements, expanded through institutional development, and now approach critical mass adoption. Current BRICS GDP represents 37% of global output, exceeding the threshold where network effects favor system expansion over contraction. Pressure without escape. The United States faces the same impossible policy choices that destroyed previous reserve currencies. Domestic economic needs increasingly conflict with international monetary responsibilities. Each policy option accelerates the transition toward alternative systems. Federal Reserve monetary policy must choose between domestic economic stability and international dollar demand. Interest rate increases to fight domestic inflation make dollar-denominated debt more expensive for foreign borrowers, encouraging alternative currency adoption. Interest rate decreases to support domestic growth reduce dollar yields below inflation rates, making dollar reserves less attractive. Government fiscal policy faces similar constraints. Spending reductions to control debt growth would trigger domestic recession, but continued deficit spending increases international financing requirements. Foreign nations must purchase $2.4 trillion in new U.S. Treasury bonds annually to finance current deficit spending. This dependence on foreign financing creates vulnerability to coordinated reduction in purchases. Trade policy cannot resolve structural trade deficits without reducing domestic consumption standards. Americans consume $800 billion more goods annually than American producers export. This consumption differential requires constant dollar outflows that other nations must be willing to accumulate. When other nations prefer alternative arrangements, the trade deficit becomes unsustainable. Military policy amplifies rather than resolves monetary pressures. Defense spending exceeds $900 billion annually, contributing to fiscal deficits that require foreign financing. Military operations often target nations that subsequently adopt alternative monetary systems. Economic sanctions force targeted nations to develop dollar-independent capabilities that benefit alternative systems. The BRICS alternative system eliminates these policy dilemmas for member nations. Local currency trade reduces foreign exchange risks and transaction costs. Alternative financial institutions provide development financing without requiring economic policy changes. Energy payments in local currencies eliminate dollar shortage constraints on economic growth. Network effects create self-reinforcing momentum toward BRICS system expansion. Each new member increases the utility of alternative arrangements for existing members. Larger trade volumes support more sophisticated financial infrastructure. More comprehensive services attract additional members and higher transaction volumes. Dollar system network effects operate in reverse. Reduced dollar trade volume decreases the utility of dollar-based services. Lower transaction volumes increase per unit costs of maintaining dollar infrastructure. Higher costs and lower utility encourage further migration toward alternative systems. The mathematical progression is irreversible once critical mass is achieved. BRICS nations collectively represent larger populations, faster economic growth rates, greater natural resource endowments, and more balanced trade relationships than dollar system participants. Economic logic favors continued expansion of alternative arrangements. The illusion layer. Standard responses to BRICS development follow predictable patterns that accompanied previous reserve currency transitions. The dollar is too established to be replaced. BRICS economies are too diverse to maintain unity. Alternative systems cannot provide equivalent liquidity and stability. Military power will preserve monetary dominance. This time is different. Historical evidence contradicts each assumption. Every previous reserve currency appeared too established to be replaced until replacement occurred. The Spanish peso dominated global trade for 2 centuries before Dutch alternatives achieved critical mass. The British pound maintained reserve status for 2 centuries before dollar competition proved decisive. Economic diversity historically strengthens rather than weakens monetary alternatives. The Dutch guilder succeeded because Holland maintained trade relationships across multiple continents and economic systems. The dollar gained reserve status because America traded with former British colonies, European nations, and Asian markets simultaneously. BRICS economic diversity provides similar advantages. China offers manufacturing capacity, Russia provides energy resources, India supplies services and manufacturing, Brazil contributes agricultural production, and South Africa provides mineral resources. This complementary economic structure supports comprehensive trade relationships that reduce dependence on external systems. Liquidity and stability develop through usage rather than existing independently. Dollar liquidity exists because international trade occurs in dollars. When international trade shifts toward alternative currencies, liquidity follows automatically. Stability emerges through institutional development and network effects rather than government guarantees. Military power cannot preserve monetary systems when economic fundamentals favor alternatives. Britain maintained the world's dominant military through both world wars, but lost monetary dominance to economically superior American systems. Soviet military power could not preserve ruble-based economic relationships when alternative systems offered better economic outcomes. Military intervention often accelerates rather than prevents monetary transitions. Spanish military campaigns drained silver reserves and encouraged alternative arrangements. British military expenditures created fiscal pressures that undermined sterling stability. American military operations frequently drive targeted nations toward alternative monetary systems. The belief that current circumstances differ from historical patterns ignores mathematical forces that operate consistently across different time periods. Superior economic arrangements attract adoption regardless of political preferences. Network effects create momentum toward larger and more efficient systems. Reserve currencies fail when their economic foundation erodes, regardless of political or military support. BRICS critics emphasize internal disagreements and political tensions between member nations. Similar criticisms were directed toward early European Union development, NATO alliance formation, and American federal system creation. Political disagreements do not prevent cooperation when economic incentives favor coordination. Dollar system advocates point to technical challenges in creating alternative financial infrastructure. The same technical arguments were used to defend previous reserve currencies. Sterling advocates argued that London's financial expertise could not be replicated elsewhere. Guilder supporters claimed that Amsterdam's commercial networks were impossible to replace. Technical challenges resolved through institutional development and accumulated experience. The BRICS payment system operates successfully despite initial technical limitations. Central bank digital currencies enable capabilities that traditional correspondent banking systems cannot provide. Alternative systems often develop superior technical capabilities by avoiding legacy infrastructure constraints. The final system statement. The BRICS $400 billion trade system represents mathematical confirmation that dollar reserve currency status is terminating. When 37% of global economic output creates comprehensive alternatives to existing monetary arrangements, the existing system faces terminal replacement pressure. This transition follows identical patterns that destroyed previous reserve currencies throughout monetary history. Alternative systems begin with bilateral arrangements, develop institutional infrastructure, achieve critical mass adoption, and eventually replace incumbent systems entirely. Current BRICS development timeline matches historical transition patterns precisely. Bilateral arrangements emerged between 2014 and 2018. Institutional infrastructure developed between 2018 and 2022. Critical mass adoption occurred between 2022 and 2025. System replacement is now mathematically inevitable rather than politically contingent. The expansion of BRICS membership from 5 to 11 nations in 2 years demonstrates exponential rather than linear adoption patterns. Energy producers, manufacturing centers, agricultural exporters, and financial hubs are joining simultaneously. This comprehensive participation eliminates the economic isolation that might prevent full system transition. Dollar system constraints create positive feedback loops that accelerate BRICS adoption. Economic sanctions force nations to develop alternative capabilities. Interest rate changes penalize foreign dollar borrowers. Trade deficits require constant foreign financing. Each constraint provides additional incentives for alternative system development. Mathematical forces operate regardless of political preferences or policy interventions. When alternative systems provide superior economic outcomes, adoption occurs automatically through market mechanisms. No policy intervention can indefinitely preserve inferior economic arrangements against superior alternatives. The United States government cannot prevent this transition through domestic policy changes. Fiscal discipline sufficient to eliminate trade deficits would require domestic consumption reductions that are politically impossible. Monetary policy sufficient to defend dollar reserves would create recession conditions that are economically intolerable. International policy interventions cannot preserve dollar dominance when alternative systems provide better outcomes for other nations. Military pressure often accelerates alternative system adoption by targeted nations. Economic sanctions force sanctioned nations to develop capabilities that benefit alternative systems broadly. Reserve currency transitions historically occur faster than contemporary observers anticipate. The sterling to dollar transition took 24 years from initial challenge to complete replacement. The BRICS system has developed comparable infrastructure in 11 years. Technological capabilities enable faster institutional development than previous historical periods. The timeline for complete dollar replacement ranges from 5 to 15 years based on historical precedent and current development rates. Critical mass adoption has been achieved. Institutional infrastructure operates successfully. Network effects favor continued expansion rather than contraction. Nations, institutions, and individuals positioned for post-dollar monetary arrangements will maintain economic relevance through the transition. Those who assume dollar system permanence will face the same wealth destruction that affected previous reserve currency transitions. The mathematical progression is irreversible and accelerating. Economic fundamentals favor BRICS system expansion. Network effects create self-reinforcing adoption momentum. Policy constraints eliminate dollar system adaptation options. This is not speculation about possible futures. This is pattern recognition of systematic changes that are currently occurring. The same mathematical forces that destroyed previous reserve currencies are operating now with greater scale and speed. The BRICS $400 billion trade system signals the end of the dollar era because it represents institutional proof that comprehensive alternatives to dollar dominance are mathematically viable, economically superior, and politically sustainable. The transition is not beginning. The transition is completing.